Aurora entered the Santa Clara market slowly, each step heavy with a mix of nostalgia and trepidation. Her eyes scanned the aisles that hadn't changed much since she'd first walked them years ago, back when she and her late husband built this place from scratch. The bright fluorescent lights reflected off the spotless white tiles, illuminating the rows of colorful produce and neatly stacked goods that made up her life's work. She walked down the familiar aisles, running her fingers along the edges of the shelves, and paused near the produce section. Frowning, she picked up an apple, inspecting its dull skin and slight bruising with a discerning eye. This wasn't how she remembered the produce when she was in charge. She searched for someone to talk to, hoping to find a friendly face among the employees. Spotting a young worker rearranging boxes nearby, she approached, offering a gentle smile. "Excuse me, dear," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I couldn't help but notice some of the fruits look a little less than fresh today." The young man looked up, glancing briefly at her before casting his gaze back to his task. "You'll have to talk to the manager about that, ma'am," he replied, barely masking his disinterest. Aurora's smile faltered, but she nodded. "All right, and where might I find him?" With a quick wave in the direction of the front of the store, he pointed her toward the manager's office without another word. Aurora straightened herself as she walked toward the office, adjusting her scarf and smoothing down her wool coat. Inside the office, Gustavo stood, overseeing the floor through the large glass window. He was tall, sharply dressed in a crisp shirt, and clearly absorbed in his own thoughts as he scrolled through numbers on his tablet. Taking a steadying breath, Aurora knocked softly on the door. Gustavo looked up, visibly irritated at the interruption. His eyes swept over Aurora, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Yes?" he asked curtly, clearly impatient. "I wanted to speak with you about the quality of the produce," Aurora started, maintaining her calm. "I couldn't help but notice some of the apples and oranges look bruised. It's just, well, it didn't used to be this way." Gustavo let out a small chuckle, dismissing her with a wave. "Ma'am, our produce goes through rigorous quality checks. I can assure you, everything meets our standards. Maybe you just had different expectations." Aurora's expression tightened, and her voice took on a firmer tone. "I know a thing or two about quality standards. This market was built on them." Gustavo raised an eyebrow, smirking with barely concealed amusement. "Oh, is that so? And did you used to run a store or something?" Aurora held his gaze, her voice steady. "I helped found this very market with my husband years ago." For a brief moment, Gustavo hesitated, but then his expression hardened, choosing to brush her off. "Well, things change, ma'am. Maybe it's time to let go of the past. Now, if you don't mind, I have work to do." A few employees, discreetly watching from a distance, exchanged shocked glances. The older workers recognized Aurora, and they couldn't believe the way Gustavo was speaking to her. As she turned to leave, the humiliation settled heavy in her chest. She felt like a stranger in the place she once considered her second home. Let me know if you like this start and want to proceed further with the chapter or adjust the style or details. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine as Marcos drove his mother home. Aurora stared out the window, her fingers tracing patterns on her lap, her jaw clenched as she tried to shake off the humiliation she'd felt at the market. Marcos glanced at her, his brow furrowed, unsure of how to address the frustration that filled the space between them. Finally, he broke the silence. "Mom, I still can't believe he spoke to you that way." His voice was low, barely controlled. Aurora sighed, shifting in her seat. "Marcos, it's fine. I didn't want a scene. I didn't go there expecting any special treatment." "But that's exactly the problem," he said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You helped build that place, and he treats you like some random stranger." "I am a stranger to him, Marcos." Aurora's tone softened, and she looked at her son with a mix of resignation and understanding. "He doesn't know who I am, and he doesn't need to, but he does need to know respect," Marcos shot back. "And he'll find out. I'm going to talk to him first thing tomorrow." Aurora's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew Marcos had inherited her fierce sense of justice, but a part of her wished he would let it go. She didn't want to stir trouble. She just wanted to feel a connection to what she built, even if only from afar. But as she looked at Marcos, she knew better than to try and dissuade him. The next morning, Marcos arrived at the Santa Clara market earlier than usual, his expression unreadable as he entered. Gustavo was busy reviewing the night shift's inventory numbers when he looked up to see his boss walking toward him with a purpose. "Marcos, good morning," Gustavo greeted, his tone professional but cautious. He could sense something off in Marcos's demeanor. Marcos didn't return the greeting. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Gustavo, his eyes cool and assessing. "Gustavo, we need to talk." "Now." Without waiting for a response, Marcos turned and headed toward his office, leaving Gustavo to follow him with a bewildered expression. Once inside, Marcos closed the door, gesturing for Gustavo to take a seat, though he remained standing. "Yesterday," Marcos began, his voice steady but sharp, "you had an interaction with a woman in the store. An older woman who tried to speak to you about the quality of the produce." Gustavo frowned, trying to remember. "Yes, I remember. She was a bit demanding. Complaining about bruises on the fruit." He shrugged dismissively. "I told her we have quality standards and that there was no issue. I handled it, Marcos." "It was nothing." "Nothing?" Marcos repeated, incredulous. "That nothing was my mother, Gustavo." Gustavo's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for words. "Your mother?" he stammered. "Yes. And do you know how long she's been connected to this place? She helped build this market, Gustavo. Every corner, every aisle. She and my father built it from the ground up. She knows this place better than you or I ever will." Gustavo swallowed hard, his confidence suddenly shaken. "Marcos, I didn't know. I mean, she never introduced herself and I—" "Exactly. She didn't expect special treatment. But you, Gustavo," Marcos's voice grew icy, "you didn't even offer her basic respect. You treated her like she was a nuisance." Gustavo's mind raced as he tried to think of how to salvage the situation. "Look, I'm sorry. I'll apologize to her personally. It was a mistake, Marcos. I didn't know who she was." Marcos took a slow, deep breath, and then he leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "That's the problem, Gustavo. It shouldn't have mattered who she was. Whether it's the owner, a customer, or one of your employees, everyone deserves respect. But you treat people as though they're beneath you." Gustavo's shoulders slumped as he stared at the floor, unable to meet Marcos's eyes. "I've thought a lot about this," Marcos continued, "and I don't think firing you would teach you anything. Instead, I want you to understand the work that goes into this place, at every level." Gustavo looked up, a spark of defiance in his eyes. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm reassigning you," Marcos replied coolly. "You're going to work as a janitor. You'll start today." Gustavo's jaw dropped, shock flashing across his face. "A janitor? Marcos, you can't be serious. I'm a manager. I've worked hard for this position." Marcos folded his arms, his expression unyielding. "And yet you failed at the most basic part of your job, understanding and respecting the people who make this market function. You wanted a position of power, Gustavo, but you don't have the empathy or humility to use it properly. So, you're going back to the beginning." Gustavo's fists clenched as he felt anger rise within him. "Marcos, this is ridiculous. A janitor? You're trying to humiliate me." Marcos's gaze didn't waver. "No, Gustavo. I'm trying to teach you. Because right now, you're not fit to lead anyone." Gustavo stared at him in stunned silence, realizing that there was no room for negotiation. Marcos had made up his mind. Later that day, Gustavo changed into the plain uniform of the janitorial staff, feeling his face burn with embarrassment as he walked past employees who used to work under him. Some looked at him with pity, others with poorly hidden smirks, but the worst was the silence, the lack of acknowledgement from people he'd once ordered around. As he pushed the mop across the shiny floors, he caught sight of Paolo, one of the longtime employees, watching him from a distance. After a moment, Paolo approached, his expression unreadable. "Gustavo," he said, leaning casually against a shelf, "how's the new position treating you?" Gustavo glared at him. "I don't need your sympathy, Paolo." Paolo chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, I'm not here to offer sympathy. Just advice, maybe." Gustavo scowled, gripping the mop tighter. "I don't need advice from someone who's been a shelf stalker for the past 10 years. Paolo's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened slightly. Funny, coming from the guy who's mopping floors now. Gustavo bit his tongue, feeling the sting of the words. After a moment, Paolo softened, sighing as he looked around the store. "You know, this place, it's more than just a job for a lot of us. Aurora and her husband, they built this market, but they also built a community. We all have a place here because of them." Gustavo forced himself to listen, though he hated the reminder. "Think of this as a second chance," Paolo added. "You don't have to like it, but maybe you could learn something from it. This market's bigger than any of us. And if you're going to be part of it, you need to respect it." Gustavo stared at him, the words lingering in his mind as Paolo walked away, leaving him to continue his new duties in silence. As Gustavo scrubbed down one of the floors near the entrance, he noticed Aurora entering the store. He quickly looked away, hoping she wouldn't notice him in his new role, but it was too late. Aurora's gaze landed on him, her expression unreadable as she walked closer. "Gustavo," she greeted, her voice calm. He forced himself to meet her eyes. "Aurora, She raised a hand, stopping him. "I don't want an apology, Gustavo. Not if you don't mean it." He felt a pang of guilt, the weight of his actions sinking in. I know I acted poorly, Aurora. I'm sorry if I was disrespectful." She nodded slightly, though her face remained impassive. "Respect is more than words, Gustavo. It's how you see people, how you treat them even when no one's watching. If you can understand that, maybe you'll understand what this market is really about." Gustavo watched her walk away, the echo of her words pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt something shift, a small, uncomfortable sense of awareness that perhaps there was more to this than he'd realized. Throughout the rest of his shift, Gustavo noticed the small, thankless tasks he'd once dismissed as trivial. He saw how the janitorial staff moved quickly to clean up spills before anyone could slip, how they stocked the shelves during the busiest hours to keep the place running smoothly. The tasks were simple, but they mattered in ways he'd never appreciated before. When his shift ended, Gustavo left the market feeling more exhausted than he ever had after a day of managing. But as he walked out, he caught sight of Aurora standing by the door, her eyes lingering on the market as if lost in thought. For a moment, Gustavo considered walking up to her, saying something, anything to try and bridge the gap between them. But he hesitated, unsure of what to say. He watched her slip quietly into the night, leaving him alone with the growing realization that this demotion might be the start of something he wasn't prepared for. Let me know if you'd like to continue or adjust anything before proceeding to the next chapter. Gustavo leaned heavily on the mop handle, his muscles aching from hours of repetitive work. He never imagined he'd spend his days like this, cleaning the very floors he used to stride across with authority. As he bent down to scrub a stubborn stain near the entrance, a voice cut through his thoughts. "Gustavo?" He looked up, surprised to see his younger brother, Eduardo, standing a few feet away, his face etched with concern. Eduardo was a few years younger, with an easy smile and an open demeanor, a stark contrast to Gustavo's usual stern expression. But today, Gustavo couldn't summon any semblance of his usual confidence. "Eduardo," he greeted, rising slowly. "What are you doing here?" Eduardo looked around, taking in Gustavo's uniform and the cleaning supplies around him. "I heard, well, people are talking. They say you're working here now, as janitorial staff?" Gustavo's jaw tightened, and he glanced away. "It's temporary." Marcos thought it would be a good lesson in humility. Eduardo watched him, sympathy clear in his eyes. "And what do you think?" Gustavo scoffed. leaning back against the wall, feeling the weight of his brother's gaze. I think it's humiliating. I didn't work all these years just to end up cleaning floors like some intern. Maybe that's the point, Gustavo, Eduardo replied quietly. Sometimes we lose sight of what really matters. Look, I'm not here to lecture you, but do you even hear yourself? Floors like some intern? You're talking about the same people who kept this place running while I was what? Gustavo cut in, feeling a spark of defensiveness. While I was managing, I was making decisions that actually mattered. Eduardo gave a small, sad smile. Do they still feel that way? Gustavo hesitated, his silence answer enough. Eduardo sighed and took a step closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. I don't know what's going on with you, but maybe it's time to listen to Marcos. Maybe this is your chance to see things differently. Gustavo shrugged off his brother's hand, feeling irritation bubbling up. You don't understand, Eduardo. You've never been in my position. You never had to work your way up from nothing. Eduardo's gaze softened, but there was a firmness in his tone. Maybe I don't understand, Gustavo, but I do know that the people here deserve respect. And right now, you have a choice. You can learn from this or keep fighting it. Over the next week, Gustavo settled reluctantly into his new role. Every task, from scrubbing floors to emptying trash bins, felt like a constant reminder of his perceived failure. Yet, every once in a while, he caught glimpses of the people around him. He saw how they treated each other with kindness, how they worked together without the constant competition he'd always encouraged. One afternoon, while restocking shelves, he noticed an older employee, Carla, struggling to lift a box of supplies. Without thinking, Gustavo stepped forward, taking the box from her hands. Here, let me help you, he offered, the words surprising him as much as they did her. Carla looked at him, her eyebrows raised. Thank you, Gustavo. I wasn't expecting, well, I appreciate it. Gustavo gave a small nod, unsure of how to respond. It's no problem. Carla watched him thoughtfully, a hint of a smile on her face. You know, I've been here a long time, Gustavo. Since Aurora and her husband opened this place. They always treated everyone like family, like we were part of something bigger. Gustavo shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where she was going with this. Yeah, well, things change. Maybe, she replied, her gaze unwavering. But respect doesn't have to. The words lingered with him long after she walked away, echoing in his mind as he finished his shift. It was the first time someone had openly spoken to him about respect, not in anger or frustration, but in a way that made him consider his own actions. The next day, Gustavo arrived at the market early, determined to finish his tasks before the rush of customers began. He was sweeping near the front entrance when he saw Aurora approaching, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Aurora, he greeted, forcing himself to meet her eyes. I didn't expect to see you here so early. Aurora gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. I come here often. It helps me feel close to the past. Gustavo swallowed, remembering what Marcos had said about his mother's connection to the market. I didn't realize how much this place meant to you. Aurora looked around, her gaze softening as she took in the familiar surroundings. My husband and I built this market from the ground up. We didn't just open a business, we built a community. Every person here matters, Gustavo. I wonder if you see that yet. Gustavo took a deep breath, struggling with the words. I think I'm starting to understand. Honestly, I never really saw it that way before. She studied him, her expression softened slightly. Respect is earned, Gustavo. Not given because of a title or position. You have to show people that they matter. He nodded, her words striking a chord within him. I'm trying. It's hard, but I'm trying. Aurora gave him a faint smile, a hint of warmth breaking through her usual stoicism. That's all anyone can ask for. As Gustavo continued with his duties, he began to notice small changes within himself. He found himself greeting employees by name, offering help where he could, and even joining the others for lunch in the modest break room at the back of the market. One afternoon, while they sat around the table, Paolo leaned back, grinning. So, Gustavo, rumor has it you actually helped Carla lift a box the other day. Didn't know you had it in you. Gustavo rolled his eyes, though a small smile tugged at his lips. Very funny, Paolo. I'm just trying to get through this. Carla, seated across from him, chuckled. Well, keep it up. Maybe you'll learn a thing or two. The group erupted in laughter, and for the first time, Gustavo didn't feel like an outsider. He felt a strange sense of belonging, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Later that evening, as Gustavo was about to leave, he noticed Marcos standing by the entrance, his expression contemplative as he watched the employees finishing their shifts. Marcos, Gustavo greeted, surprised to see him. What brings you here? Marcos turned, offering a faint smile. Just checking in. I wanted to see how things were going. Gustavo shifted, feeling a mix of pride and humility. I think I'm starting to get it, Marcos. It's not just about managing people. It's about connecting with them. Marcos nodded, his gaze thoughtful. It's about understanding what people need, not just what they can give you. That's something my mother taught me. Gustavo hesitated, the weight of Marcos's words settling heavily on him. I owe both of you an apology. I took this place, and everyone in it, for granted. Marcos's expression softened, a hint of approval in his eyes. It's good to hear you say that, Gustavo. But remember, actions speak louder than words. Keep proving yourself, and maybe someday you'll truly understand what this market stands for. Gustavo nodded, a sense of determination filling him. I will. As he walked home that night, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about redeeming himself in the eyes of Marcos or Aurora. It was about becoming a person worthy of the trust they'd once placed in him. In the following days, Gustavo found himself genuinely enjoying the work he once despised. He laughed with the employees, listened to their stories, and even began to take pride in the small details that kept the market running smoothly. For the first time, he saw the market not just as a stepping stone to something greater, but as a place worth caring about. One evening, after closing time, he spotted Aurora waiting by the entrance, her gaze soft as she watched him. Gustavo, she called, her voice carrying a hint of warmth he hadn't heard before. He walked over, feeling a swell of gratitude. Aurora, I just wanted to thank you for giving me this chance. Aurora studied him, a gentle smile gracing her face. You're starting to see, aren't you, what this place means? He nodded, emotion welling up in his chest. Yes, I think I am. And I want to make it right, for everyone. Aurora placed a hand on his shoulder, a look of approval in her eyes. Then keep going. Keep proving yourself. Because one day, Gustavo, this market might just depend on you. The Santa Clara market was quiet. Its usual hum softened in the early hours as Gustavo arrived for his shift. He had barely begun setting up for the day when he noticed Marcos at the entrance, looking pale and slightly unsteady. Marcos's usual poised appearance was missing, replaced by something fragile and strained. Marcos, Gustavo called, concerned. He approached, noticing a slight tremor in Marcos's hands. Are you all right? Marcos forced a small, tired smile. Just a bit under the weather. Nothing I can't handle. But Gustavo wasn't convinced. He watched as Marcos leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. You don't look fine, Marcos. You should go home and rest. We can manage things here. Marcos shook his head, his gaze distant. I appreciate the concern, Gustavo, but there's something I need to discuss with you. Gustavo frowned, sensing the gravity in Marcos's tone. Of course. Is everything okay? Marcos took a slow breath, gathering his thoughts. Gustavo, there's something I haven't told you. Something I haven't told many people. He paused, looking away before continuing. I've been diagnosed with a chronic illness. It's been progressing faster than I expected. The weight of the revelation hit Gustavo like a wave, leaving him speechless. Marcos, I didn't know. That was the point, Marcos replied, giving a weak smile. I didn't want anyone to know, but now it's becoming harder to hide. And I'm afraid that, eventually, I won't be able to manage the market the way I used to. Gustavo stared at him, emotions swirling. He had always seen Marcos as a figure of strength, a man who carried the weight of the family legacy with unwavering dedication. The thought of him being vulnerable, possibly unable to continue leading, was something Gustavo hadn't prepared for. "What can I do?" Gustavo asked, his voice soft but steady. Marcos met his gaze, a mixture of hope and urgency in his eyes. "This market, it's my family's legacy, Gustavo. My mother, she built this place with my father. It's more than just a business. It's a part of our community." Gustavo nodded, feeling the significance of Marcos's words. "I need someone I can trust to carry this forward," Marcos continued. "Someone who understands the people, the work, and the respect that my mother and father invested in this market. I need you, Gustavo, to be that person." Gustavo's breath caught. "Me?" He shook his head, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Marcos, after everything I've done, the mistakes I've made." "That's exactly why," Marcos interrupted, his voice firm. "You've made mistakes, but you're learning from them. I've seen the change in you. I've watched you connect with the employees, respect the work they do, and find value in things you once dismissed. That's growth, Gustavo. But am I really ready for this?" Gustavo asked, a hint of doubt in his voice. "What if I fail?" Marcos's expression softened. "You won't be alone, Gustavo. My mother will be here, and so will the employees. They're your team, and they want to see this market succeed just as much as you do." Gustavo took a deep breath, the weight of the offer settling on him. "If you're willing to trust me, Marcos, I'll do my best. I promise." Marcos placed a hand on his shoulder, a glimmer of relief in his eyes. "That's all I asked." Later that day, Gustavo found himself in the small break room with Aurora. She was sitting at the table, quietly sipping her tea, her gaze thoughtful as she looked out the window. "Aurora," Gustavo began, sitting across from her. "Marcos told me about his health." Aurora looked at him, her expression unreadable, though her eyes softened with the pain of a mother's worry. "Yes, he told me too. It's not easy to accept, but he's strong." Gustavo nodded, feeling a newfound respect for her resilience. "He wants me to take on more responsibilities. He said he trusts me to help lead the market, to carry on the legacy." Aurora studied him, her gaze piercing yet calm. "And do you feel ready for that, Gustavo?" Gustavo hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't know. Part of me feels honored, but another part wonders if I can live up to what you and Marcos have built." Aurora gave a faint smile, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "You're learning, Gustavo. Leadership isn't about knowing everything. It's about listening, growing, and caring. Marcos sees something in you, and so do I." He looked down, humbled by her words. "Thank you, Aurora. I promise I'll work to earn that trust." Over the following weeks, Gustavo took on more responsibilities, guided closely by Aurora and occasionally by Marcos when his health allowed. He met with suppliers, reviewed staff schedules, and even began handling customer complaints with patience he hadn't realized he possessed. One day, as Gustavo was going over inventory in the back room, Paulo walked in, a mischievous grin on his face. "Look at you, Mr. Manager," Paulo teased, crossing his arms. "Guess the janitor days are behind you, huh?" Gustavo chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think I'll ever forget those days, Paulo. They taught me more than I could have learned from any office." Paulo raised an eyebrow. "Really? So, does this mean you'll be joining us at the company picnic this year? I don't think we've ever seen you at one." Gustavo paused, surprised. "A picnic? I didn't know you had one." Paulo laughed. "Of course we do. It's a tradition. Every year, Aurora and Marcos host it for the employees and their families. You should come. It'll be good for you." Gustavo smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't anticipated. "I think I will." On the day of the picnic, Gustavo arrived at the park, a sense of anticipation mixed with nervousness settling over him. He wasn't used to such informal gatherings, but he wanted to be a part of this community, to show them that he was one of them. As he wandered through the park, he saw Aurora laughing with some of the employees, sharing stories and reminiscing. Nearby, Marcos sat in the shade, watching everyone with a contented smile despite his visible fatigue. "Glad you made it," Marcos greeted as Gustavo approached. Gustavo smiled. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." Marcos glanced around, taking in the cheerful atmosphere. "This is what my parents wanted when they started this place. A sense of family, of belonging." Gustavo nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Marcos, for everything. I've learned so much about humility, respect, and the real meaning of community." Marcos placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes bright. "Keep learning, Gustavo. Keep growing. That's all we can do." As the sun set, Gustavo found himself sitting beside Aurora, watching as the last of the employees packed up, their laughter echoing across the quiet park. "Do you know, Aurora," Gustavo began, his voice thoughtful, "I never imagined I'd feel like this. Like, I belong." Aurora smiled softly, her gaze warm. "That's the beauty of this place, Gustavo. It has a way of drawing people in, making them a part of something bigger." Gustavo looked at her, gratitude filling his eyes. "Thank you for giving me a chance. For not giving up on me." Aurora reached over, taking his hand in hers. "We all make mistakes, Gustavo. It's what we do after that defines us." Gustavo nodded, her words resonating deeply within him. He realized now that this market, this community, had become more than a job. It was his family, and he was ready to protect it, just as Aurora and Marcos had. Let me know if you'd like to move to the final chapter. As the days passed, Gustavo settled into his new leadership role, but this time with a much different mindset. He moved through the market's aisles with a newfound sense of purpose, checking on employees, listening to their concerns, and making changes that benefited everyone, not just the bottom line. He was no longer the same man who dismissed the market's customers and workers as mere obstacles on his path to success. One evening, as the market was closing, Gustavo found Aurora sitting quietly in one of the aisles, a soft smile on her face as she gazed at the rows of shelves. Her presence was so peaceful that he hesitated to interrupt, but she noticed him and gestured for him to join her. "This place, it's not just a business, is it?" Gustavo began, sitting beside her. "It's a part of who you are, who Marcos is." Aurora looked at him, a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Yes, Gustavo. It's a legacy. My husband and I didn't just build walls. We built a community. And we did it with respect, understanding, and a commitment to everyone who walked through these doors." Gustavo nodded, a sense of responsibility settling over him. "I used to think success was about power, about being in control. But now, I see it's about people, about the relationships we build." Aurora reached over, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "You're starting to understand. That's all I wanted for you." Gustavo smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for giving me a second chance." The next day, as Gustavo was finishing some paperwork, Marcos entered his office. He looked better than he had in days, a bit more color in his cheeks, but his eyes held a seriousness that Gustavo recognized. "Marcos," Gustavo greeted, setting down his pen. "How are you feeling?" Marcos gave a slight nod, though he didn't meet Gustavo's eyes. "I'm all right. Better, actually, but that's not why I'm here." Gustavo frowned, sensing that this was more than a casual visit. "What's going on?" Marcos took a deep breath, his gaze finally lifting to meet Gustavo's. "I've made a decision. With everything going on, my health, the future of this market, I think it's time I step down." Gustavo's eyes widened, shock and concern flashing across his face. "Marcos, no. You don't have to do this. We can manage things together. I don't want you to feel like you have to leave." Marcos shook his head, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "Gustavo, I appreciate that. but I've come to realize that holding on too tightly isn't always the answer. I want to focus on my health, my family. And more than that, I want to make sure this place is in the right hands." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I want you to take over, Gustavo." Gustavo stared at him, words failing him as he processed the magnitude of what Marcos was offering. "Me? Marcos, are you sure?" "Yes," Marcos replied firmly. "I've watched you grow, change, become someone who truly cares about this market and the people in it. You're ready." Gustavo shook his head, emotion welling up in his chest. "I don't know what to say." "Just promise me one thing," Marcos said, his tone serious. "Promise me that you'll protect what my parents built, that you'll honor the values that this market was founded on." Gustavo nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise, Marcos. I'll do everything I can to make you and Aurora proud." Marcos smiled, relief and pride shining in his eyes. "Then I can step back, knowing this place is in good hands." As the weeks turned into months, Gustavo took on his new role with a quiet determination. He worked closely with Aurora, making changes that would preserve the spirit of the market while also adapting to the needs of the community. He became a familiar face not only to the employees but to the customers as well, greeting each person with the warmth and respect he had once struggled to understand. One afternoon, as he was helping restock shelves, he noticed Eduardo standing at the end of the aisle, a grin on his face. "Look at you, Mr. Big Shot Manager," Eduardo teased, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've come a long way, Gustavo." Gustavo chuckled, shaking his head. "I wouldn't have believed it myself if you'd told me this a year ago." Eduardo's expression softened. "I'm proud of you, Gustavo. I know it wasn't easy to go through all of this, but you've changed, and it shows." Gustavo nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you, Eduardo. I wouldn't be here without the support of you, Aurora, Marcos, everyone." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling around them. "You know," Eduardo began, his voice thoughtful, "Mom and Dad would be proud of you. They always wanted you to find something you believed in, and now you have." Gustavo looked down, feeling a pang of emotion at the thought of his parents. "I hope so. I think, for the first time, I'm really starting to believe in something, and it's worth every struggle." Months later, Gustavo organized a small gathering at the market to celebrate the legacy of the Lemos family. Employees, customers, and even former staff members filled the aisles, sharing stories and memories of the market and the impact it had on their lives. As the evening wound down, Gustavo took a deep breath and stepped up to address the crowd, his heart pounding as he looked out at the faces before him. "I just want to say, thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This market isn't just a place to buy groceries. It's a community, a family, and it's an honor to be part of it." He paused, his gaze shifting to Aurora and Marcos, who stood together at the front, pride and warmth radiating from them. "Aurora, Marcos," he continued, his voice thick with gratitude, "thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it. You've taught me the true meaning of respect, of humility, and I promise, I'll carry on your legacy with everything I have." The crowd erupted into applause, but it was the nods of approval from Aurora and Marcos that meant the most to him. They had given him a second chance, and he intended to honor that gift every day. As the market lights dimmed and the crowd began to disperse, Aurora approached Gustavo, a soft smile on her face. "You did well, Gustavo," she said, her voice filled with pride. Gustavo smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't known before. "Thank you, Aurora. I'll never be able to repay what you and Marcos have done for me." Aurora shook her head, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You already have, Gustavo. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's all we ever wanted." They stood together in silence, the quiet hum of the market surrounding them, a place that had transformed both of their lives. And as Gustavo looked around, he knew that this market, this community, was where he belonged. It was no longer just a stepping stone. It was home. This concludes the final chapter, tying together Gustavo's journey from a man driven by ambition to one transformed by humility, responsibility, and community. Let me know if you need any more details.